Good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to the Centre Culturel Irlandais and to this evening's conversation, which focuses on the psychological thriller, the Whydunit, instead of the Whodunit. And delighted to welcome back Declan Burke, no longer as chair, but as writer, Jane Casey and Liz Nugent. Liz, of course, will be with us next year as artist in residence, so we'll possibly be hearing more from Liz next April. And Declan Hughes, who'll be chairing the conversation. And I'll hand over directly to Declan. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. Yes, we will be talking about the Whydunit. We will also be talking about the police procedural, and we'll also be talking about comic fiction. But I suppose we should be emphasizing always the psychological, that is to say, the human characters that populate the crime stories. I'm going to introduce each of our authors. I'm going to ask them each to read a brief passage from their works, because by their works you shall know them. And then they will lie about themselves and their works, and you can happily discount all of that because you'll have already heard the truth out of their own mouths. Liz Nugent's first novel, Unravelling Oliver, won the Irish Book Award for Best Crime Novel in 2014, as did her second novel, Lying in Wait. Her third novel, Skin Deep, was published this year. All three books have been massive bestsellers in Ireland. Liz's work is also published internationally, widely. She is Irish crime fiction's rising star. Jane Casey is best known for the 8 novels in her highly successful Maeve Kerrigan series. 2 were nominated for Irish Book Awards. She won the award for After the Fire. The Stranger You Know won the Mary Higgins Clark Award. She has also written 3 YA mysteries featuring teenage sleuth Jess Tennant. The new Maeve Kerrigan is eagerly awaited by me and will be published next April. Declan Burke has published 6 novels, including 8 Ball Boogie, Absolute Zero Cool, and The Lost and the Blind. Absolute Zero Cool won the Goldsborough Crime Fest Award for Best Humorous Crime Novel in 2012. He was the editor of Down These Green Streets, an invaluable resource for Irish crime writing, and co-editor with John Connolly of the Edgar-nominated Books to Die For, mystery writers on their favourite mystery fiction. His website, Crime Always Pays, is Irish crime fiction's public square. Maybe Liz, you might start us off? With the reading.
Okay, this is, hello, and thanks for coming. This is from my most recent novel, Skin Deep. In ancient times, MacDermot the Weaver was famous throughout the length and breadth of the country for the fine garments he could produce from even the roughest wool. But MacDermot had a scold for a wife. She was possessed of the longest red hair that swung down to her ankles, and it was her pride and joy. She would sit outside her cottage on a stool, combing it through with hard fish bones to be admired by the passing islanders. But she was lazy, it was said. And if her children ran wild and hungry like tinkers and brought trouble to the harbour where they'd be hopping boats and pegging stones at fishermen, she would blame her husband and roar at him in the street, bringing shame upon the man. MacDermot could not help but love her despite all her nagging, but the neighbours got fed up of it, and one day they held her down and hacked her hair off with knives. Then they ordered MacDermot to weave a sheet from her hair that would sit on the harbour wall as a warning to all of the wives. Daddy always said that the red fronds that covered the wall were the woven hair of MacDermot's wife, but I was old enough to know that it was seaweed. MacDermot and his wife rarely ventured outside their cottage after that day, except to collect necessary items for their household. They spoke little and kept their heads down when at the market. The wife's hair grew back faster than anyone had imagined possible. When 1 year had passed, her flame-coloured mane reached her knees, and she began to look up again, to hold her head straight, and to look the world in the eye. But the islanders did not like her arrogance, and it was said that the nagging had begun again. that children passing could hear it through the thick walls of their cottage. One day, MacDermot's wife was caught in the act of badgering her husband, complaining that he hadn't built the fire hot enough for her to bake bread. This time, the neighbours were merciless. They dragged her down to the harbour wall and hacked her hair off again. But this time, they forced her to eat it until she choked to death. Daddy used to tell me this story while I was curled on his lap, but he'd be staring at Mammy while he told it. Daddy said if a man couldn't keep his woman in order, his neighbours would have to do it for him.
Thanks, Liz. Now, I'd ask Jane to read from, I think this is your most recent novel, isn't it? Yeah.
This is from Let the Dead Speak, my most recent novel. I hate reading after Liz because she's such a brilliant reader, so bear with me. This scene is at the beginning of the novel, and it's basically the team of investigators going in for the first time to a house where something terrible has happened and walking through it without knowing exactly what's gone on. The lights were on in the hall and at the top of the stairs, and it was too bright for comfort. Blood flared off every surface, dried and dark, but still vibrating with violence. I didn't know anything about the victim, and I didn't know what had happened here, but fear hung in the air like smoke. Don't think about it now. The facts came first. The emotions could come later. What happened here? Derwent had stopped at the top of the stairs, moving to one side to let the rest of us join him. A huge, wavering bloodstain had soaked into the carpet that covered the floor. We think this was possibly where the first major injury was inflicted. There's a lot of blood downstairs, but in small quantities up to this point, Whydunit said. Maybe defensive wounds, maybe transferred from up here on the attacker's clothes and hands. The blood had settled into the weave, spreading out so it was hard to tell how much there was. Not enough to be an arterial injury. Survivable, potentially, I thought. This isn't a great surface for us, is it? Nope. Kev gestured at smudges on the woven surface. Those are footprints and knee prints. No detail, no definition. Give me a nice tiled floor any day. You've got the hall downstairs, Derwent said. Except that we had people in and out with wet feet before I got here. The coppers had the sense to step carefully, but the others... Kev raised his eyes to heaven. You'd almost think it was deliberate. If it hadn't been for the rain, we'd have a lot more to go on. Who was that, I asked. One of the two residents, a female aged 18, and one of the neighbours, Whydunit said. He gave her a lift back from the station. They came in and found this. You'll need to talk to both of them. I nodded and followed the trail to the small bathroom on the right, staying in the doorway because there was nowhere to stand that wasn't covered in brownish-red residue. The shower curtain hung down, ripped off most of its rings, streaked and splattered like the walls, like the ceiling, like the cracked mirror where we were reflected like a gathering of particularly awkward aliens. There were partial handprints on the sink, which was chipped, and the toilet. The seat had come away from the hinges on one side, so I could see the blood ran down inside the bowl, where it had settled thickly under the water. It had been a white room once. Christ, Derwent said. How many victims did you say there were? Whydunit ignored him. This is the main location for the attack. It's human nature to want to hide, and there's a lock on the bathroom door, but this was the worst possible place to run to. It's a small space with one exit and not much you could use to defend yourself. The attacker was able to stand in the doorway and cause maximum damage at his or her leisure. His, surely, Georgia said. Her eyes were round and very blue above the white mask, but her voice didn't tremble. Sexist, Derwent observed, and she turned to look at him. You can't assume it was a man, I said. You can't assume anything.
The glamour of the crime scene. Yeah. Blood on the bowl. Declan, if you'll read a passage now for us.
Absolutely, Sarah Cool started out, I'd written a book about a hospital porter called Carlson, who for various reasons best known to himself, he decides to blow up the hospital where he works. My agent read the book and stopped about 2/3 of the way through. He said it was unpublishable, which was fine. That's his job. He's there to give advice and so forth. So the book went in the drawer for about 3 years, and then one day, shortly after our daughter was born, I was looking out the back window, the office window, and it was as if I saw Carlson standing at the back of the garden, just standing, and as if to say, what about me? What happens to me now? So I got the idea of writing a book about the process of writing a book when a character comes back to confront a writer who has abandoned him. The man at the foot of my bed is too sharply dressed to be anything but a lawyer or a pimp. He is reading intently, which leads me to believe he is a pimp, as these days lawyers are more usually to be found writing novels than reading them. Above his head, close to the ceiling, a gecko in Irish racing green is the only splash of colour in a room that is otherwise entirely white. White walls, white tiles on the floor. The window blinds, bedside lockers, sheets wainscoting the door, all white. As it is a manuscript of a novel the man is reading, the page facing me is white. His eyes meet mine. "You're some man for one man," he says. He lays down the manuscript, comes up with a newspaper. "They're a day behind here," he says, "but you get the drift." The newspaper's front page is dominated by a charred hospital that appears to be teetering at an angle. I reach for the pen and pad on the bedside locker, scrawl one word: Rosie. He gets up and comes around the bed, takes the pad. "The wee girl's okay," he says. "Some smoke in her lungs, apparently, but nothing serious. She'll be fine." He unfolds the newspaper and leafs through. Reading between the lines, he says, they reckon the best you can hope for is criminal damage, and that's claiming insanity. Start out full-blown, work your way down to temporary. You could be out in 5 years. That's the best-case scenario. A man cannot live tilted away from the world. The world will not permit it. Gravity will have its way. He must live straight, upright, or not at all. Worst case, he says, they'll be pulling out the big guns, offences against the state, terrorism, the works. I mean, there's no specific law against blowing up hospitals, but let's just say they've plenty of wiggle room to play with. He waits. The air conditioner hums. From beyond the shuttered window, faintly, comes a bird trip of cicadas. So that's the good news. The bad news, he says, holding up the op-ed pages, tapping the editorial, is they're saying you couldn't have been working alone. They're saying you must have had help, maybe a whole cell. There is nothing to add to this. It would appear that all effort has come to naught. He folds the newspaper and tucks it under my pillow, retrieves the manuscript, which he places on the pristine sheet beside my hand. He lays a red pen on top so that it underlines the title, The Baby Killers. "Seeing as you won't be going anywhere for a couple of days," he says, "I thought you might like one last skim through, see if we can't kill a few more babies." My line for today comes courtesy of Samuel Beckett. "Ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better."
Dark enough for you yet? Liz, at the centre of each of your novels is an extremely disturbed individual. In the first book, it's a man. In the subsequent two, it's a woman. Is it my imagination, or are these people getting darker by the book? And maybe you could talk a little bit about, because it's clearly an attraction that you can't resist to these kind of characters.
Yeah, I'm really attracted to psychopaths in fiction. I just find them interesting, and I think, you know, if you look about in televisual terms, like, would you rather watch John Boy Walton or Tony Soprano or Walter White, or, you know, I think these very flawed, very damaged characters are interesting, but in each one that I have written, they have got quite a bit darker.
Yeah.
Delia is the worst character I've ever written, so I'm trying to kind of lighten things up a bit in the next book, because I don't think.
For sure, I don't
yeah.
believe. I literally don't believe you.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm writing a character at the moment who, yeah, he's pretty bad, but I don't think he's as bad as Delia. She's just the worst. But I try to write these characters from the inside out.
Yeah.
I try to put myself into their heads so that I can see the world the way they do.
Yeah.
And I think psychopaths, sociopaths don't wake up in the morning and saying, "Oh, who am I going to kill today?" It's not like that. I think they will always justify their actions. Everything that they do will be perfectly rational and normal and explainable to them.
Do you feel that because the male, so Oliver justifies and men tend to justify, whereas with female psychopaths, this is a great generalization, I know, but there's almost a sense of entitlement. It's not, they don't have to work, it feels with Delia, she doesn't have to work very hard to think that whatever it is she needs to do, she just has to do.
Delia is different from the other two in that she's not as smart. She's kind of like an alley cat. She will fix the immediate problem, and she never looks at the long term. Whereas Lydia and Oliver were extremely manipulative and what's the word?
Controlling, knowing.
Controlling, planning.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
yeah.
Whereas Delia is not. She looks at, what can I do to fix this immediate problem?
It's like
I'll marry this guy, or I'll get in a boat and I'll go here, or I'll do this. She doesn't think about the long term. So in some ways, it was easier to write her because
she's just responding.
She's just responding. She's reacting to the immediate situation at all times.
I know we just talk about the books, but you came relatively late to writing, and yet you write the most persuasive psychopaths possibly since Highsmith.
I've worked for loads of them in my time.
I'm just thinking, were you muttering in? Were you that woman at the end of the bar muttering into across the counter? How did you this outlet? How did you fulfill it before?
I think I was just a very frustrated non-writer beforehand.
Yeah.
I mean, I worked in TV soap opera land for 10 years, and I worked in theatre rehearsal rooms as a stage manager for 15 years before that. So I was always on the periphery of other people's writing.
Yeah, and also other people's psychosis.
And other people's psychosis.
I come from the theatre too. I understand what you're saying.
But even in the TV job I had an administrative role. It wasn't to do with the story. I was the administrative backup to the story team.
Sure.
So I was kind of dancing around story all the time, but never actually getting involved in it. And I just became more and more sort of dissatisfied and frustrated and unhappy, because I just felt at times, I could actually do a better job than this if they let me. And at various times I tried, and because of the RT contracts and one thing and another, I wasn't allowed to write because I was a staff member, and you had to be a freelance contractor in order to write for the show and that kind of stuff. So I ended up I applied. I wrote like in my spare time, in my holidays, I wrote like Sunday miscellany pieces, and I wrote an 8-part series for T.G. Carr, a kids series, and I wrote a one-off drama for T.G. Carr, and some children's stories.
No psychopaths.
Well, somebody always died in every single one of them.
Okay.
But
we can speculate about a series of a frustrated backroom soap opera, script editor, and then the writing team seems to be dying off one by one, and she gets her big break.
That could happen. That could happen.
Talk to me a little bit about, because the extract you read is very interesting, and these sections are interpolated throughout the novel, and they are kind of a mythic backing to Delia's case. Is that, am I right in thinking that?
These are the stories. Delia's father, when she is a child, when Delia is a child, she is absolutely idolized and worshipped by her father to the exclusion of the rest of her siblings. And he tells her these awful, grotesque, horrific stories that no father should tell a small child. But in each case, they foreshadow something that's going to happen within the next couple of chapters, so you get a clue as to what might happen. But really, the whole idea of the island and Delia herself are very linked. Delia is extremely beautiful, like the island, but she's extremely remote, like the island. She is cold to the bone, like the island. She is dangerous, like the island. Like islands have that kind of romantic mysticism about them, but they're wild and they're rugged and they're dangerous places to be, and they can be cut off for long periods of time.
Yeah.
So it totally encapsulated the character of Delia.
Right.
So I just tied the two together.
Is there a sort of larger sense of, through her father, the patriarchy is, you know...
Somebody did say to me that I had written a brilliant feminist novel, but I didn't set out to do that.
Yeah.
I may have ended up with one, but that wasn't in my consciousness. When
I wasn't going as far as to say she's a feminist heroine.
No,
but,
she's not a heroine.
But the seeds that are sown
when I was writing it, I mean, the abortion referendum was very current. You know, that was in the air, and you know, women's rights and Me Too, and the women in theatre, you know, waking the feminist movement had started.
Yeah.
So, and I was involved with a couple of those things. So, unconsciously, they must have influenced the writing, because when I look at it now, at a distance, I can see, yes, there is a strong female character, although she's a monster.
Yeah.
But she is...
she's a daddy's girl.
She's a daddy's girl, but also she is... some readers there's been a bit of a backlash to the character for some readers, not because of some of the more horrific things she does, but because she leaves her child.
Right.
Whereas a male character would not be judged in the same way.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, a male character can be an absent father and still be the hero of the story.
And that's the only thing they're lighting on. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's interesting.
That is the least bad
because
thing
the
she
mother,
does, really.
pretty much, yeah. She's actually
in fact,
doing
that's
him
an
a
act of
favour.
mercy. Yeah. It's an intervention.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Okay, Jane, talk to me about. It seems to me, in any great police procedural series, the thing we love about it the most are the characters of the detectives. And however complicated and interesting the cases they work on, the through line of the development of those principal investigating characters is crucial. And in the case of Kerrigan and Derwent, just enthralling. So talk a bit about maybe the beginnings, how it's developed, and what your interest in their psychologies is.
Sure. Well, the first editor that I had on this series, which is going back quite a long time, I think I started writing them in 2009. She said to me, "You need to come up with characters who people will care about, because readers care about characters and remember them. They don't remember authors. Authors aren't important. It's all the characters." And the second editor I've had on them has a slightly different take on them. She says the reason that she likes them is because they are basically psychological thrillers with a police procedural structure.
Right.
Now, for me, I think the thing about procedurals is that you always come in after the fact. Like, the detectives turn up to start investigating when the blood is dry, as in the piece that I read. And so you're always coming into this story beyond the point where the first incident has happened.
But you start with the characters outside, the characters who are going to die or who are going to, yeah.
Very, very often you might have a bit, but in that particular book, the body is dead.
Yeah.
I mean, we're there,
Yeah.
basically. And so the action of the story, like the people who you have to care about, the people you have to be worried about, and the people who have something to achieve are the police officers.
Right.
So actually, they are the ones who you're sort of identifying with as a reader.
Yeah.
And that's what I try and do. And the main character, Maeve Kerrigan, is in the classic police detective style. She's an outsider, not because she's kind of a troubled person. She's not. But she has this slightly equivocal position where she has Irish parents. She's grown up in England. She's one of the few women doing the job that she's doing. She's quite young, and all of her sort of status is dependent on other people granting her that status and allowing her to do what she does. And so she's always sort of fighting her corner and having to defend herself and having to justify doing the things that she does, even though she really wants to toe the line and be a good police officer. And she's not kind of one of those mavericks, but she's very affected by everything that happens and each case that happens. And I was talking to somebody about this and about male writing and female writing, and if the two are the same or if you can tell. And I think there's a huge discussion about it. Like, I actually don't think writing is gendered, but I notice in male crime writing very often the main character is unchanging from book to book. Like, if you think of a Lee Child novel, Jack Reacher is the same on page 1 of the first book and on the last page of the last book. And he is consistent. He affects the world around him.
Yeah.
He isn't affected by it in the way that Maeve is very much affected by what she comes across and what she has to do.
Maeve's been in trauma recently, the last few books. Would you talk about how you handled what happened to her and the consequences of that? Because there's an extraordinary scene in After the Fire, I think it is, where she's reacting and she kind of loses it in a nightclub. And it's such a brilliant example. It's not explained, but immediately, if you've read the previous books, you know what it's about. But if you haven't, you think, oh my God, and it's brilliant. It's so deft, and it's so extraordinary. It's a wonderful example of showing, and then we go, what? You know? Talk a little bit about, because it's very patiently. I'm being coy for a reason.
I know. I'm trying to think how to talk about it without spoilers. I try and avoid like the obvious bad things that can happen, but basically, because she has a traumatic incident where she is cornered by a group of young men, and she can't get away from them, and then she does. But they threaten her with all sorts of things, and she knows that they will carry it out. And that leads her to then withdraw from other people and not talk to them properly, and then that leads to the end of a relationship, which then has a knock-on effect to where she ends up in the nightclub, trying to deal on her own with the fact that she has a stalker, basically.
Yeah.
So trying to take things into her own hands. And she's always trying to do it on her own.
Yeah. That's
the thing. And because she has this relationship, this sort of love-hate relationship with Derwent, her boss,
like we all do.
He's simultaneously her biggest problem in life and the only one who I think she can really rely on. So he sort of forces her to trust him.
Yeah.
Which I think is an interesting.
And talk about, I mean, Derwent is that classic kind of, like the guy in Life on Mars, you know, was a kind of pastiche of, but he's the guy you think is going to be corrupt. He's politically incorrect. He's old school, and yet, you know, his bark is a lot worse than his bite. And
but like, this is the thing. This is like, I probably shouldn't even admit this, but he was only ever supposed to be in one book.
Right.
And then I wrote him in the second Maeve. He's not in the first Maeve Kerrigan book at all.
Yeah.
He comes into the second one and basically steals the book from everybody else. And when I sat down to write the third one, he was in the car with her, being very annoying. I was thinking, wait, you're not even supposed to still be here. But he's just one of those characters who's really fun to write. He's got a heart of gold.
Yeah.
But he also doesn't put up with anything, basically. He doesn't want to just, he says exactly what he thinks when he thinks it.
And he's like an id. He's like the police id.
He
just
is.
saying the worst thing and then going, nah, I didn't mean that. But he sort of does and he sort of doesn't.
Oh, no, he never says I didn't mean that.
No, all right,
he
okay.
always means it.
But he's getting softer. He's yeah.
I mean, it's partly, I think, because you can't, if he was the centre of the books, I don't think anyone would read them.
Yeah, no.
Because he's too abrasive. But also, he is growing and developing and changing and learning from Maeve, and she's also she pulls him out of trouble quite a lot, which I quite like. I like that she's not being rescued all the time. I like that she rescues him.
Yeah.
So
and technically, your lead detective has to have someone to talk to, right? you know.
It helps if they're funny.
Yeah, indeed.
Like, and they do have good banter, which is
Yeah.
very enjoyable.
Since we're talking about Irish crime fiction, and you grew up in Castleknock, talk to me about the choices around setting your work in London.
I mean, I was at the talk last night when you were talking about where you set your books. It's partly the impossibility of believing that bad things can happen somewhere like Castleknock, which I think, funnily enough, now I feel slightly less. I think at the time that I started writing, I found such a safe place. There was nothing exciting that could possibly happen there. And now I'm kind of more interested by what might go on there that we don't know about. London is a brilliant setting. I really wanted to write about somebody who is the child of the diaspora, because it's such a huge thing in Ireland. Like it's the defining characteristic of Ireland is that we all leave.
Yes.
And what happens to those children? Her parents are very determined to give her and her brother exactly the upbringing that they would have had in Ireland.
Yeah.
But they're in London.
Yeah.
So what does that do to your how does that change your character, that you're not one thing or another? You're not Irish and you're not English and you're kind of somewhere in the middle that's not defined.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to explore that.
It's like the obverse of, we were talking last night, and many Irish crime writers talk about the influence of American or English fiction, crime fiction, on their fiction, and it's then, I don't know, in rock's music equivalent, it's like, the Smiths or Oasis or the Pogues are kind of Irish as well because of their parentage, and so there's a sort of connection. But you're first generation Irish, but it's still it's these books are, and maybe that's what I like about them. They don't feel as English in an English tradition. Mm-hmm. So maybe that goes back to the sense of the psychological thriller, that the characters are more important than the procedure. Is that always in your mind? I mean, you don't take steps to, you make sure all the facts are correct or the procedure is correct, but it doesn't seem to, like in some procedurals, just get in the way or clutter things up.
Yeah. I mean, procedure is very boring.
Yeah.
And my husband is a massive police nerd.
Right.
And he is always saying, oh, well, they'd have to fill out form 45B, and then they'd have
well,
to
we
go
want to read that. Yeah,
I mean, just fall off your chair.
He's a
with
barrister,
boredom.
isn't he? Yeah,
He's a barrister, and he also volunteers as a police officer.
Oh, good God.
So he covers everything from like going out and arresting people all the way to the Court of Appeal. He took me to the Court of Appeal for that book.
Okay.
We have the best dates.
Yeah, sure.
But you can get very bogged down in it, and actually that's not what people are interested in.
No.
But it has to be there. It's the same with any research. I do the research, you don't have to know about it.
Yes, of course.
So it's there, but I take it out almost a lot of the time. Like I just to keep the plot moving.
Yeah.
And it is more interesting.
Also, I can't remember who said it, but for example, with PI fiction and police procedurals, all police officers eventually end up behaving like PIs. They go rogue. Because it's more interesting if they're just moving faster than procedure will allow, and all PIs behave like police officers because they're investigating murders, which they're not entitled to do. So you have to kind of mix it up and heighten it so that it will explode a little kinetically.
Yeah, inspectors never get out of the office; they just do paperwork.
Yeah.
So I can't just have Dermot sitting in the office doing paperwork.
Well, maybe your husband can write that series. We'll suggest it to him. Declan.
Thank you.
Talk about John Balville called Absolute Zero Cool, a cross between Raymond Chandler and Flann O'Brien. I think the book might be seen as an exploration of aberrant psychology, but more the psychology of the writer than the individual character.
That would be fair comment or question. I'm not sure which it
bit
is.
Of both.
A bit of both, indeed. Yeah, I mean, I should possibly have said that Absolute Zero Cool was in fact written as a comedy, blowing up hospitals and all. So you can imagine how bleak were the books that didn't win that award that year. Yes, it was an exercise in exploring my own psychology at a particular time. I mentioned in the introduction my daughter had been born shortly before I started reworking that manuscript, and at the risk of sounding glib and mawkish, I was never a person who thought his life was going to be dramatically changed by a child, and was then proved completely wrong in very short order. And suddenly, having written a number of crime novels that were quite dark in tone and execution, and had modelled themselves on a bleaker variation of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and that kind of West Coast private eye style, I now had to confront the reality of what kind of material I was writing. You're not just writing about violence, of course, when you're writing crime novels. You're right; it's the consequences of violence and the consequences on the victims. But you still have to write the violence in order to explore the consequences. And I quickly realized that I was not the kind of, personally, I was not the kind of hard man my characters were pretending to be. And I thought it would be an interesting exercise to create a character who was a hard man, a sociopathic character who wanted to blow up his own hospital, and then have him interact with the kind of person I thought I was becoming now, a person who was aware of of issues about violence, about the Carlson character, for example, the hospital porter. He wants to blow up the hospital not for any great sociological or psychological reason. It's because he needs to do something that's going to get the attention of publishers, because if he isn't published, he's damned. He's going to be stuck in this limbo. So he just wants to blow up a hospital just to make something dramatic, so the publisher will say, oh, that's an interesting idea, we'll publish that. So then the author, who is never named but is quite clearly me if you've been kind of following the course of the novel, is kind of pushing back all the time against this unnecessary violence and against this sociopathy, which is there to sell books as opposed to be explored as, a consequence of the way society is today, or whatever it happens to be. So that was the kind of scene in my head. That was what I was trying to explore during the course of that book.
It's your ultimate metafictional crime novel. Yeah. And it is the example of how restlessness marks your writing career. You've written PI, you've written caper comedies, you've written spy fiction. What's going on, Declan?
Restlessness is the perfect word for it. I like all different kinds of books.
Yeah.
I think if people tend to be immersed in the crime or mystery genre, they tend not to stick with police procedurals alone, not simply psychological thrillers. I certainly like the entire gamut. I fascinated by all aspects of the crime and mystery genre, but also beyond that, much more beyond that. As long as a book is a good book, I'm very happy to read it. So writing time for me is short. So I'm trying, or was trying, to do as many different things as I possibly can to kind of prove to myself that I could. And you realize that, well, actually, I'm good at that. Okay, I've done that. I wasn't so good at that. I won't try that one again. But it's an exploration of the basic skills of writing are the same, I think, no matter what genre you're working in or what subgenres and so forth. The building blocks are all the one. And the challenge for yourself is to say, well, can I apply those skills to a different style? Can I write a spy thriller using the same tools I used to write a private eye novel? Because really they're the flip side of the same coin. Yeah. Can I write a comedy crime fiction in which nobody gets killed, and in fact, nobody gets hurt in the entirety of this crime novel? Can we do that? Can we get away with that? Can it work? Can it be considered a credible crime novel if we do? So things like that. I come up with an idea for a book, and then within about 20 pages, I'm going, that's obviously too easy. That'd be far too. Let's another an obstacle. We can't kill anyone. No, in fact, we can't even hurt anyone. Next, it'll be no bad language, and I'll have completely made impossible.
You said to me once in private conversation, so obviously I'm going to repeat it here, that you'd said to an editor possibly, yeah, no, I'm going to do this, and it was insert conventional genre here, but I'm going to do a spin on it. And then you thought, why don't I not do the spin? Why don't I just write the book? But actually, it's hard not to do the spin now because we have the books. So you've always got to find a different angle, or it's very hard to just do a conventional thing, I think. But certainly it seems that's how you feel.
And I don't think it holds true just for me. We spoke briefly about this last night, that everybody starts off with, an idea for a book, and it's a big idea. And by the time you get, a quarter or a fifth of the way into the book, you realize you're going to need more. That one idea isn't going to sustain the entire 80,000, 100,000 words, and I'm going to have to come up with a subplot, or I'm going to have to come up with a variation, or we can call it a twist or a spin, whatever you want to call it.
Or you find out you had a theme, it just wasn't conscious to you until it emerges.
Well, absolutely, and I think it was Alex said last night, you're often not aware of what the theme is until halfway through the book. It generally takes me a couple of redrafts before I realize what it was I was trying to tell myself all along. So I don't think it's unusual for a writer to be even halfway through a book before A, they realize what it is the book is about, and B, they realize I'm going to need another couple of obstacles for these characters to jump over, so therefore the book becomes either slightly or radically different than what you perceived it to be when you started out. And I'm certainly not the only writer ever to have got to the finish line, look back and have no idea where I came from starting off.
Sure. Talk to me a little bit about PI fiction, because it's a subject close to my heart. It was very prominent, and it is so much less prominent in crime fiction at large now. I wonder why that is. Sometimes it seems as if there are accidental private investigators, journalists, more or less investigating in the same way. Have we lost
insurance investigators?
Investigators. Yeah. Have we lost our faith? Has it become too much of a cliche?
Cliche is probably too strong a word. Like you, I came first through Enid Blyton and the Famous Five and the Secret Seven, and then to the great Agatha Christie novels. But then the kind of the Hammett and Chandler particularly, they gripped the imagination because of the way they wrote, as much as the kind of stories they wrote. But yes, there was something mythic about the idea of the tarnished knight, almost the Don Quixote character who tilts at the windmills and so forth. And even reading it, and even as a young man reading it, it's an impossible dream, this idea that one man can change the world.
Good man in a tarnished
and Lee
world.
Childs, Lee Childs is still doing very well with that idea. But I think that it had its time and maybe had its place. It was always heavily linked to, it was an American subgenre much more, I think, than elsewhere. And I think the idea that one man can, change the world, it died a death through the post-Second World War, through the 50s and 60s, the Nixon and so forth. There was an idea that, the single and solitary figure simply wasn't going to cut it. Now, there have been great private eye novels and private eye writers since, but they are, I think, the exception rather than the rule. I think we're perhaps, as readers, we're too literal and too hyper-aware of how unlikely it is. As you say, private eyes don't investigate murders. They're not allowed. They wouldn't have the facilities, the technical demands of tailing a single person down a street. You need 3 people to do it effectively. So this idea of a guy flitting from shadow to shadow with the fedora tucked up, it doesn't work anymore. It's not.
So they become functionaries in very large agencies, which are exactly the kind of agencies private eyes should be investigating.
Yes, and again, these sounds like kind of novels that Jane's husband should possibly be writing.
That's right. Yes. I'm going to ask just a couple more questions, and then I'm going to open it to the floor. So if you'd like to prepare questions for these wonderful writers, you can be turning them over in your head. Liz, I asked you this last year, and I'm going to ask you it again, because you didn't give me the right answer. No, I know you're a crime, like Whydunit and I, you're a crime writer by mistake, in that you didn't read much in the genre, but it's impossible to notice that you've been blurbing people for the past couple of years. So you must have read more crime fiction in the last 3 or 4 years
Than I've ever read before in my life. Yeah.
How is it to be in a genre you were relatively unfamiliar with and reading it almost in retrospect? Talk to me a little bit about that.
It's kind of odd. I suppose I was kind of a book snob or a genre snob, and I kind of read exclusively literary fiction, with a few kind of romantic fictions. I love my Marion Keys and you know all that kind of stuff, and because of the way we are conditioned and the coverage, it was usually white middle class men that I was reading, you know. So that was my kind of schooling. So when I set out to write Unravelling Oliver, genre didn't enter my head. I just wrote the story that was in me, and that was the story that came out. So when it was classified as crime, I was kind of puzzled at the beginning, and then I was thinking, brilliant, way more commercial for a start.
Sure.
You know, this is I can possibly make a living doing this now, because if it had been classed as literary fiction, and it's not highbrow enough, the writing isn't good enough to be lit fic, but if it was, I wouldn't be able to make a living at it.
You'd need to win a prize.
Well, you'd need to win a cash prize, and they're few and far between. But so coming late to crime fiction, the first time was when, you know, that year when I was at the nomination in that category, and I read the other crime novels, which included Jane's and Sinead Crowley's and Hannah French, and I read them all in glut, and I was kind of going, holy shit, what have I been missing? Like, these are amazingly, brilliantly, the writing is no less good, the writing is a really high standard, really high quality, but there's so much plot, there's so much story, which had been missing from a lot of the literary fiction. I was reading Beautiful Sentences where not a lot happened, you know, and suddenly I could read Beautiful Sentences where everything was happening, and it was a revelation to me, an absolute revelation. So I've still got a huge amount to catch up on. I haven't even read a Stephen King novel yet, so I've a huge amount to catch up.
Have you caught up with Highsmith?
No.
See,
not yet.
Every time
I
I'm going to say to you,
I'm
Highsmith.
sorry. I know.
You've never read Highsmith? Oh, you should. Bad women.
I know.
She writes about... Actually, no. She doesn't write about bad women. That's the thing about Highsmith. Highsmith was a misogynist. She writes about bad men. So she is a case in herself. But the style of bad men would be very familiar to... I mean, there's a lot of Olivers in there.
I'll definitely, I have a lot of homework to do. But, you know, if you all could just stop writing books so that I can catch up, that would be really helpful.
It's a wonderful situation to be in. Jane, talk to me a little bit about, I think you've booked 9 in April, is that right?
Yes,
I
think
told
so.
them it would be out, so and 10 is not out in the pipeline.
I'm writing 10 at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dennis Lehane famously said, no one ever says the 17th is my favorite about a long-running series. Talk a little about, have you experienced series fatigue yet, or do you consciously take steps to defer or avoid it?
I think because the characters, the series characters are so interesting to me. I haven't got tired of writing about them. It's very hard to vary the structure. That's probably the thing that I spend most time trying to think about. Like, how can I begin this novel in a way that's gripping, but isn't the same way as all the others? I mean, if you watch any kind of crime series, they all pretty much start the same way. Like Law and Order is, you can tell, it's 9:20. It must be, this is the bit that they're on.
Sure.
So I don't get tired of it, and I kind of... I still have lots of stories that I want to tell about those characters and plots that I want them to explore and experience. But I'm sort of getting a little bit itchy feet, and I would like to write something set in Ireland. I would like to kind of explore that a little bit more, and I don't know. I feel like there's other places that I want to go and other things I want to do, but it's always crime. Like I it's so funny to me because I never wanted to write anything other than crime.
Sure.
And every time I try and sit down and write something that's not crime, I kill someone. And then it's all over. So there's something that just obviously draws me to those stories.
I'm always hesitant to say this because I said it before and then somebody translated it into he never reads anything but crime fiction. But a part of me does not consider a book a proper book unless there is some kind of mystery. So, and it even extends to, like, The Great Gatsby is a kind of mystery story. You know, I don't mean I'm considering it crime fiction. I want to expand the genre to include every book that I like. It's just an ancillary question, because I think you first published 2009, 2010? 2010. So were you aware of the eruption of activity among Irish crime writers? Or yeah. So did you look at it and go, oh, I'm having a bit of that, I can do that. I can do better than that. I can do better than that. Indeed. Yeah.
Not at all. No.
No. That's a good thing to think.
I was kind of aware of it and awed by it and impressed by it. But like my first book, I never thought anybody else would read it.
Yeah.
So I just sat and wrote it for my own benefit.
Right.
Honestly, the only thing that I wanted to do was get to the end of it.
Yeah.
And then once I'd finished it, then I thought, well, maybe I can use it to get an agent. But I never thought it would see the light of day.
Okay.
So I like the Irish crime writing scene. I think it's fascinating because the Scots have kind of branded themselves as a tribe of writers, and the Scandinavians have been wonderfully sold as a kind of, anything basically from the north of Europe is Scandinavian crime fiction, as far as like Iceland. It's not really Scandinavian, but it gets lumped in among it. And Irish crime fiction is so diverse.
Yes.
Like it really is. It's kind of almost uncategorizable. And I wonder, this is a bit philosophical, but like Irish people are really bad at doing what they're told and don't really like rules and regulations.
I was going to say the joke about the first item on the new Irish left-wing party is on the agenda is the split.
It's just like we're not very good at towing the line, and I don't know whether that kind of like there's a slightly subversive element in Irish crime fiction.
That's really intriguing, and I think you have something there because. Yeah, I've often bemoaned, why didn't we get our act together like the Scandies and just, become this force across the world? But it's probably because although we all get along, but we won't agree on a program.
We're all going in different directions, taking it in different places.
Last question, Declan, and it's in your role as sort of curator, so to speak, of Irish crime fiction. And it's pressure. Look, trends, what's up, what's down. I mean, I referred last night to whatever you want to call it, psychological thriller, domestic suspense being just the genre of our time in a way that 10 years ago you couldn't move for serial killer books. There are still a few, but they're nowhere near as popular, or people aren't writing them as much. What do you think is now, or what do you think is in a couple of years' time coming towards us?
You're definitely right about the domestic noir. It's international, so therefore it's I think Irish writers and perhaps even Irish editors are, there's nothing wrong with their savvy.
Yeah.
They know what is selling right now, and therefore they are either snapping up or steering their authors towards the crime authors towards the domestic subgenre. And I do feel, like you suggested last night, it's in danger of tapping itself out. There is, there will, once it has gone through the cycle, we'll look back and we say, well, there were 4 or 5 stone cold classics in the same way as there are some 4 or 5 terrific serial killer novels. I think the, the novels that are being published in Northern Ireland or by Northern Irish writers that are not necessarily, we did have a slew of novels that were based or backdropped by the Troubles. What's coming through now seems to be possibly more interesting because it's about policing in a time of peace, ostensibly a time of peace after the Troubles, but in fact matters are every bit of are complicated and complex from a policing point of view, because all the elements are still there that existed during the Troubles, except there's the added dimension of having to pretend everything is just hunky-dory.
So there's a kind of faux consensus.
Well, absolutely, yes.
Good, no violence, but a lot of problems.
Brian McGilloway's most recent one, the name, sorry, it's a Lucy Black novel. Is his main character set in Derry. It's
Brian Gilloway's most recent one. That's what we call it.
Okay, that's what we call it. But it's very good at that. The idea of the violence that's still bubbling under, and in fact, Colin Bateman's most recent one too. It's about the potential for the fragile peace in Northern Ireland to be ripped apart. Not quite as a moment's notice, but there are elements placed there. And with Brexit looming, and a hard Brexit particularly looming, you realise how fragile, via looking through these crime novels, you realise, well, actually these guys are not just prophesying doom to sell books. These are these are elements. So to me, that what's happening in Northern Irish crime fiction at the moment, for the last couple of years, and possibly as a consequence of Brexit going forward for a couple of years, I think that's where the most interesting work, obviously present company accepted, but I think that's where, as a subgenre, will be found.
Interesting stuff. Thank you.